Reactions from the Wild's preseason opener, alternate captains, and some potential line changes all coming up today on Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to today's episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we are going to recap the preseason opener for the Wild against the St. Louis Blues with some notes from the game and looking ahead to what's coming up this week for the Wild. We'll also talk about the alternate captains that were announced over the weekend, and we will look at some interesting changes to the Minnesota Wild's lines that have happened so far throughout training camp. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild, veteran of over 10 years of Minnesota sports coverage, including the last couple of seasons covering your Minnesota Wild. Thank you for tuning into Locked On Wild today and making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Just a reminder, Locked On Wild is free and available on all podcast platforms, including on YouTube at Locked On Wild. Happy to have you along for a Monday edition of the show. And as mentioned, we got a lot to talk about here today. Just kind of some news and notes to get you going on your Monday. We've got a full week coming up as well. So plenty more on that coming up throughout the show as well. Why don't we start by looking at the Wild's preseason opener? They took on the St. Louis Blues, and unfortunately for the Wild, much of the same as the Wild lost to the St. Louis Blues in their preseason opener by a score of 5-2. Some things to take away. It was a little difficult to find the game because it was on the Bally Sports Midwest app, and that was pretty much it. Game was on the radio, so that ended up being kind of the method of following the action. And some positives to take away from the preseason opener. Adam Beckman, got to start right there, as he had 2 goals and got the Wild as close as he could, and just continues to really look like a guy who maybe not this year, but a little bit down the line in the future, definitely could have a role on this team and could be somebody that gives them some much needed offense as we get further and further into the Parise Suter buyouts. So Beckman with a couple of goals, and that ended up being a pretty much the only bright spot of the game, as Kaapo, Kahkonen, and Andrew Hammond struggled in this one. Now, it was interesting to note that the Blues put pretty much their entire roster out there. They did have a couple of guys on tryouts that were part of the lineup, but a lot of regulars in the lineup for the Blues, and so you look at that and you look at what the Wilds did in the lineup on their end, and so it kind of explains why the score was the way that it was. And some interesting quotes to pull from Dean Evason in regards to what happened throughout the game. In regards to Marco Rossi and Matt Boldy, Evason saying that they both were good, but the veteran guy with them was not. That was Jordan Greenway in last night's game. So an interesting comment there. Evason said that he did not like how his Wild NHL guys conducted themselves in the preseason opener. Evason also saying that the Blues didn't want to do a shootout, but the Wild will do shootouts for all 3 of their home games. It is a wrinkle in the preseason that they're going to try to throw in. So interesting that it was, Rossi and Boldy that kind of were leading the charge, and Evason not really that happy with what he saw from Jordan Greenway on that line. Looking at a little bit of what we've seen from the Wild in terms of lines. We'll talk more about this later on in the show as to whether or not these lines make sense. But this also from Michael Russo. And this is kind of what the Wild have been going with for line combinations, at least throughout the early part of practice. Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, Matt Zuccarello, then Jordan Greenway, Ryan Hartman, Marcus Felino, Victor Rask, Freddie Gaudreau, and Kevin Fiala, Brandon Duhaime and or Kyle Rao, Nico Sturm, and Nick Bjugstad. Then on defense, we've got Goligoski and Spurgeon, Broden and Dumba, Merrill and Kulikov, and Mermis and Ben has been what they've been going with for practices here over the last couple of days. So some interesting things to take away from that as well. We will discuss that in the final segment of today's episode, but wanted to, when we come back, take a look at the alternate captains that were announced over the weekend. The Wild with two very deserving players that got the nod in that capacity. So we'll talk about that and a couple of other odds and ends things next here on Locked on Wild. Does this sound familiar? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows, you're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all of that entertainment you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes and no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part, there is no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package. Continuing with today's episode of Locked on Wild. And again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen every day. We'll be taking a look at the rest of the week for the Wild here, as well as what we can expect from their line combinations as they roll them out. But once you're done listening to today's show, make sure to head over to Locked on Vikings for your second listen. Big win for the Vikings over the weekend, so make sure to have the breakdown of that with Luke Braun at Locked on Vikings after you finish listening to today's show. Looking at those line combinations for the Wild, but before we get there, alternate captains have been announced for the Wild and were over the weekend. That includes, of course, Marcus Felino, and we'll start with Felino and just talking about kind of what he has brought to this roster. Felino, obviously, the enforcer on this team, the physical presence, kind of the leader of that physical presence in this group. So obviously has been a really unsung part of what this team does well. And so a really good choice for alternate captain to go along with Jared Spurgeon, the other alternate captain, Matt Dumba, who we'll talk about in a second. But anytime the Wild need to establish a veteran presence or need to be a little more physical if they're getting kind of bullied around, it's Foligno that is the one that that kind of levies that for the team. So he is a great pick as one of those alternate captains. And you look at Matt Dumba, a guy who has really been at the forefront of some of the social justice pushes throughout the entirety of the NHL. And, you know, with the times where they're at right now, obviously he is a great fit there, but also what he brings to the ice, a guy who is going to have an opportunity to step in and fill some of the void left by many of the defenders that left in free agency or in buyouts. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity for Dumba to add to what already is a pretty consistent workload. Dumba's been a guy who's averaged, you know, right around 20 minutes a night on the ice. So could he see 23, 24 if he's playing well? Absolutely. And so you have Jared Spurgeon as the captain continuing to lead by example. And I think just a great fit for this Wild team with what they are needing as we shift from the old guard to the new guard with Parisian Suter gone and some of the other past veterans, Mikko Koivu, of course. Some of those guys gone. Now you've got this new wave of leadership for the Minnesota Wild. And so it makes a lot of sense for them to go with Spurgeon as the captain, and then Felino and Dumba as the alternate captains. And I think it's a great pick. It also apparently was unanimous from the team. Evason letting the team kind of weigh in, and those guys got unanimous support. So that is great for this locker room as well. And it's going to be great to see kind of that leadership group help lead this team throughout the course of this season. Let's go back to the line combinations that I mentioned from Michael Russo that the Wilds have been employing here over the start of the preseason. Obviously, some very interesting things to take away from these lines. So we start with Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, and Zuccarello. Obviously, Victor Rask not on that line as of right now. And, you know, one of the big parts and focal points of the offseason was trying to get some better center play around Kirill Kaprizov. And Joel Eriksson Ek at present is the best center that the Wild have on this roster. And so you put some really good scoring wings around him, and he can give kind of that veteran presence. That was, I think, one of the things that this team lacked in the playoffs, was anytime the Kaprizov line was out on the ice, the Golden Knights were trying to kind of lock them down defensively with some of their better defensive forwards. There really wasn't anybody that could physically match up on that line and bring it right back. Eriksson Ek would be able to do that as just a pest defensively. He would definitely be able to assist Kaprizov and Zuccarello in that regard. And we saw it last year. You know, he added the goals to the arsenal and was able to chip in on a few other assists throughout the season. So I think this is a good fit. Is it the ideal fit long term? Probably not. But as of right now, until somebody like Marco Rossi proves that they're ready to hop up and take that spot, this will probably work out pretty good. And it gives Kaprizov a better center than he had with Victor Rask. And so I think the objective there is probably taken care of, is to try to get a better center on that line. And, you know, we'll see how it plays out if they stay with that combination. But as of right now, that seems like the best way to go. Then obviously you go to, you know, the big ripple effect from moving Eriksson Ek to that top line. Then Jordan Greenway and Marcus Felino paired with Ryan Hartman. And Hartman, a defensive guy himself at the center position. Now, the scoring takes a hit on this line, but they're still going to be able to bring a good defensive presence and a physicality to their game. Again, I'll say I'm a huge fan of Ryan Hartman, but I don't know that he is a center long term. And, you know, maybe it shifts to where that ends up being his primary position for the next few years. I'm willing to let it play out and see if he can do it, especially with how he looked at the end of the season and into the playoffs. Kind of kicked it up to another gear. So if he can do that, and if he can help with getting some scoring opportunities to Felino and Greenway, and can help keep that line intact as kind of that bruising, physical defensive line, then I'm totally fine with it. I mean, it's better than what some of the alternatives could be. This third line is going to need a lot of work. I'm not super thrilled with what is going on with the third line, which is Victor Rask on the wing, Freddie Gaudreau at center, and Kevin Fiala is your third line. We saw it last year with the line mates that Fiala had, one of which down the stretch was Victor Rask. It did not go well. So I think this is going to be the line. This bottom six is going to see the biggest jump in terms of line combinations and in terms of players being called up or sent down. Because I think, as I've said on the show previously, I'm willing to give Freddie Gaudreau an opportunity to show what he can do, because I think he does have an element to his game that was not fully unlocked with the Penguins that I would like to see unlocked here. But Victor Rask on the wing is not super inspiring to me, and maybe he ends up playing better on the wing. I think that this third line is not going to be what we see at the end of the season. That, I think, will be the line that gets the most changes. And then the fourth line has Duhaime and Kyle Rau kind of alternating in with Nico Sturm and Nick Bjugstad. I think that also is another spot where we could see somebody come up and fill, depending on performance or injury. I think we could see somebody like Matt Boldy or Marco Rossi hop up and fill that spot. And ultimately, I think Boldy and or Rossi give you more than what a Kyle Rau could, even if you're going to get a little bit of a slow start from those two. They still, I think, give you way more than Kyle Rau. We've seen what he can do at the NHL level, and it's basically just fill time on the ice. And so you may as well give those opportunities to one of those guys in Boldy and Rossi and allow them to develop on the ice, allow them to kind of get comfortable so that going forward, they don't have to have any of those jitters when they're going to be more relied upon to be a big part of this team. Now, obviously, early on in training camp, we've still got a few preseason games to go, and so there's plenty that could happen. And do I think that this ultimately is what we see heading into the regular season? No, I don't. I think your top six is probably pretty much locked in. Those two lines, I think, are pretty much put in pen as to what we'll see. But that bottom six, I think, could look dramatically different by the time we're done with the preseason and get to the regular season as well. If you want to leave a comment on YouTube with what you think the line combinations should be, we will get to those in a future episode this week. So just comment with what you think the line combination should be. And for those listening on the podcast, hit us up on Twitter at LockedOnWild with what you think the line combinations for the Wild should be this year. So we'll get to those throughout the course of this week as well. Any responses that we do get. We will finish up today's episode of Locked On Wild by taking a look at what's coming up here this week. Another preseason game later on in the week. We'll also look ahead to some other things that the Wild have cooking. A news and notes Monday edition of Locked On Wild continues after this. This fall, Built Bar wants to help you celebrate freedom of choice. Did you know that Built Bar has amazingly delicious flavors? They include coconut, cherry barcia, raspberry, mint brownie, double chocolate, salted caramel, strawberry, orange, cookies and cream, and German chocolate. Sorry, fall fans, no pumpkin spice. Maybe it's on the way. We'll see. My favorite flavor, for what it's worth, is raspberry, and so that is not a bad place to start if you are new to the Built Bar craze. But if you aren't really sure where to get started, you can grab a mixed box where you'll get 2 each of the 9 flavors. Not only are Built Bars amazingly tasty, but they are amazingly healthy too. They contain 17 to 18 grams of protein, range in calories from 130 to 180, contain only 4 to 5 grams of sugar and only 4 to 5 grams of net carbs. So they are amazing in taste. They are amazingly healthy for you. What's not to like about Built Bar? So head to built.com and enter the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off of your order. Again, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Thanks for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Coming up tomorrow, we will be doing a crossover episode with Locked On Stars. Happy to have Dane Lewis, the new host of Locked On Stars, hopping on the show tomorrow to take a look at Dallas's offseason and what they can expect coming into the season this year. I think Dallas has a really good chance to bounce back and be a major portion of the conversation in the Central Division. So you can listen for that coming up tomorrow here on Locked On Wild. Finishing with just a few news and notes items for the Minnesota Wild. They did cut the preseason roster down to 46 as Caden Bankier was sent back to Kamloops, Damon Hunt to Moose Jaw, Carson Lambos to Winnipeg, Kyle Masters to Red Deer, Pavel Novak to Kelowna, and Ryan O'Rourke also optioned out, as well as invitees Bryce Misley and Trevin Kozlowski. They will report to Iowa ahead of the Iowa Wild's training camp. So those guys off of the training camp roster. Also, a few other interesting notes as Dean Evason really impressed with the Adam Beckman, Damian Giroux, and Will Bitten line. Says that Beckman brings much more than just a guy willing to always shoot the puck, brings grit and an infectious energy to his game. So Adam Beckman, a guy that we look at and say, yeah, he's not going to be part of this Wild roster this year, but I think he's a guy that we could see within the next couple of seasons get an opportunity with the Wilds to hop in and to give them some meaningful minutes in one of those bottom six roles. You look at the current composition of this team: Victor Rask with the Wild this year for $4 million, and then after that, he will become a free agent. I don't think the Wild, unless he comes back on a discount and a lesser role, I don't think that the Wild are going to try for a reunion with Victor Rask. So that will be a spot that will open up. Nick Bjugstad currently on a one-year deal. Does he come back after this current season? I would assume if he does, it is on a similar type contract to what he currently is making, which is slightly under $1 million for this Wild roster. Jordan Greenway, his current contract is up after this season. So does he come back? With some of the recent comments Dean Evason has made, he might be a guy that the Wild opt to just let go to a different arena, a change of scenery. That might be best for Greenway at this point, unless he really pulls together a nice season here this year. So even just looking right there, just off the top of my head, there are 3 spots that could potentially be open for the Wild going into next season when they have less salary cap space, and they're also trying to work out a long-term deal with Kevin Fiala. So those elements put together, Kevin Fiala's contracts and some departing players in a spot that the Wild could stand to save some salary cap space, leads me to believe there are going to be some spots for entry-level guys that could really impact this team. So Adam Beckman's future, I think, is a bright one. As for when specifically he finds his way to this Wild roster, not entirely sure. And so we will just have to kind of wait and see what his trajectory looks like. And that will depend on some of those moves that I mentioned. If they pan out, there will be spots available for this team. And they'll need somebody to fill them. The Wild are off until Thursday, when they will be taking on the Colorado Avalanche on the road. 8 o'clock start for that game. So we'll try to keep tabs on it as best we can. And then after that, the preseason schedule for the Wild looks like this. They've got, I think it's 3 consecutive home games after that. They host Colorado again on Monday the 4th. Then Wednesday the 6th, they play St. Louis, and that Wednesday game is on ESPN Plus. Then Thursday the 7th, they host Chicago, and Saturday, October 9th, the preseason comes to a conclusion on the road against Chicago. So a chance to still see some things from this Wild roster. I would imagine Cam Talbot will make his preseason debut in Colorado after seeing Kahkonen and Hammond in the first preseason game of the year. So I would imagine we'll see Cam Talbot, and we'll see probably the likes of Kirill Kaprizov and some of the other guys. So a chance to see new contract Kirill Kaprizov in the preseason coming up, hopefully this week. So a lot to look forward to, and so that's why I kind of figured that we would start the week with a news and notes recap of the weekends, look forward to what's coming up, and just some other general observations as well. We've got a lot of guests coming up here the rest of the week, as mentioned. We'll do a crossover with Locked On Stars, so you can listen for that coming up here tomorrow. And I think that is going to wrap it up for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. And as mentioned, we will be back with Locked On Stars, taking a look at what went on with Dallas this offseason. Make sure for your second listen today that you hop over to Locked On Vikings, get a recap of that big win by the Vikings against the Seattle Seahawks with Luke Braun. A great breakdown coming as Kirk Cousins just diced them. So make sure that is your second listen of the day. Make sure you're following Locked On Wild wherever you listen to podcasts. Social media includes Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, also on the docket now, so you can subscribe for new videos like this one, and make sure to turn notifications on so you don't miss out on any future videos as well. And you can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.